Steve Harvey had been walking to his car when he heard someone singing. That detail mattered, the walking to his car part. The show had been 2 hours. He had done what he came to do. The audience had gotten what they came for. There was a specific quality to the end of a successful evening that he had learned to recognize over 30 years. And this evening had that quality, the clean, complete feeling of a thing done. The drive home would take 40 minutes. He had a dinner that had already started without him, and a driver who had been waiting since the second encore. The show was over. The venue was clearing. His security team was already at the exit. He had a dinner in 40 minutes, and a driver who had been waiting for 20. There was no reason, in the ordinary accounting of a night that had already finished, to stop. The sound was coming from behind the loading dock, in the specific alley that ran behind the venue, and that existed in the way these alleys always existed, as the functional back of a building whose front was all lights and warmth and presented faces. This was the part that wasn't presented. Concrete and dumpsters and the smell of a kitchen's exhaust and the particular dark of a city block at 11 at night. And someone in that dark was singing, not performing. There is a difference. And Steve Harvey had spent enough years in enough rooms to know it at the distance of 30 feet. Performing is for an audience. What he was hearing was for no one. It had the quality of something that was happening because it needed to happen, the way water finds level, the way a person breathes. The voice was doing what it needed to do because it had to, not because anyone was listening. He walked toward it instead of away from it. The man was sitting on a folded piece of cardboard between two dusters, with the specific economy of arrangement that people develop when the arrangement of what they have is the primary daily act of organization. The cardboard was positioned so that the wall behind him blocked the wind that came down the alley from the north. The jacket was buttoned to the top button. These were not random. They were decisions, made and remade each night, the small architecture of a life being lived with the resources available. He was wearing a jacket that had been through more weather than it was made for, and boots that were doing the same job. He was somewhere in his 60s, though the years had been the kind that don't add in a straight line. His eyes were closed. His hands were on his knees, loosely, the way hands rest when the rest of the body is somewhere else entirely. Not in pieces, not absently, the way people sing when they are doing something else. In full, with his whole attention, the way you sing something when it is the thing you are doing and there is nothing else. Steve Harvey recognized it in the second bar. His eye is on the Sparrow. He had known this hymn since he was 7 years old. He had heard it in more churches and at more funerals and in more kitchens on more Sunday mornings than he could count. He had heard it sung by people who had been singing it their whole lives, and people who had just learned it, and people who sang it because the occasion required it. He had never heard it sung quite like this. The man's voice was a baritone that had not been maintained or trained or preserved in any deliberate way. It was just what it was, the natural instrument of a man who had spent 60-something years on earth, and whose instrument showed the years in the way that great instruments show them. Not worn down, but worn in, the roughness and the depth in the same place, indistinguishable from each other. Steve Harvey stood at the mouth of the alley and listened. He did not announce himself. He did not take out his phone. He stood at the edge of the loading dock light and listened to a man sing a hymn to no one in an alley at 11 at night, and the hair on his arms did the thing that hair does when a body is receiving something larger than it expected. When the hymn ended, there was silence for a moment. He looked at Steve Harvey. He looked at him for a long moment, with the specific look of someone who has been where he had been for long enough that surprises have largely been reorganized into categories. Steve Harvey did not fit into any of the existing categories. The man's expression adjusted. "I didn't know anyone was out here," the man said. His voice was the same voice, the same roughness, the same depth. "I heard you singing," Steve Harvey said. The man looked at him for a moment with the specific assessment of someone who has learned, from long experience, to read intention at distance. He was trying to determine what kind of stop this was, the kind that led somewhere specific or the kind that didn't. Didn't mean to disturb anybody. You didn't. The man looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded slightly, in the specific way that people nod when they are acknowledging that a thing has happened and are not yet sure what to make of it. His name was Henry James Porter, and he told Steve Harvey his name the way people tell names when they have not been asked for their name in a while, with the specific care of someone reintroducing something they want to be handled correctly. Steve Harvey would learn this over the next 40 minutes, along with other things, that Henry Porter was 64 years old, that he had grown up in Memphis and had spent most of his adult life in Chicago, that he had worked in loading and receiving for a wholesale company for 21 years before the company was bought and the warehouse was automated and the jobs had not come back, that he had been living outside for 11 months, that he had a daughter in Detroit named Carol, who was 38 years old and who he had not spoken to in 2 years, not because of a fight, but because he was ashamed of what she would find if she found him. That he had been a deacon at Greater Shiloh Baptist Church in Chicago for 7 years before things had gone the way they had gone, and that he sang hymns at night because they were the thing that had gotten into him so early and so deep that they had survived everything else. Which one was that? Steve Harvey asked, though he knew. His eye is on the Sparrow, Henry Porter said. He said it the way people say the names of things they have known their whole lives, not introducing it, just naming it. Why that one? Henry Porter looked at him. The question was an honest question, and he received it as one. Because it says what it says, he said. The sparrow doesn't worry. The sparrow's taken care of. He paused. I like having that said to me. Steve Harvey sat down on a concrete step that was part of the loading dock. He was in dress clothes from the show. The concrete was cold. He sat down anyway. Tell me about Carol, he said. Henry Porter looked at him. How did you know? You mentioned her. I don't remember. You said her name a minute ago. Henry Porter was quiet. He looked at his hands on his knees. She doesn't know where I am, he said. She thinks I'm in a program somewhere. I let her think that. Why? Because she's got her own things. He paused. She's got 2 kids. She works 2 jobs. She doesn't need to know that her father is. He stopped. He made a small gesture that indicated the alley and the cardboard and everything that surrounded him. She'd want to know, Steve Harvey said. Henry Porter was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands again. He had the specific stillness of a man who has been sitting with a decision for a long time and has arrived at the same answer so many times that he has stopped calling it a decision and started calling it a fact. He shook his head, not in disagreement, but in the way of someone who has had this argument with himself many times. Maybe, he said, maybe she would, but the wanting to know and the being able to help are different things, and I don't want her spending on me what she needs for those kids. Steve Harvey looked at him. You're making her decision for her, he said. This had not been said to him before, or had been said in a way that he hadn't heard, or had been said and he had heard it and put it down. He held it for a moment. She's 38 years old, Steve Harvey said. She raised 2 kids and works 2 jobs. She didn't do any of that without making hard decisions. And she didn't make hard decisions by having someone make them for her. She has already made harder decisions than this one. Let her make this one. The alley was quiet. Somewhere behind the dumpsters, something small moved in the dark. You came from that show, Henry Porter said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, you're the one they're all there to see. Tonight, yeah. Henry Porter looked at him. You got someplace to be? I did, Steve Harvey said. I called ahead. Henry Porter made a sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one, the sound of a man who had not expected this evening to contain whatever this evening was containing. Steve Harvey pulled out his phone. He looked at Henry Porter. What's Carol's number? Henry Porter looked at the phone. He looked at Steve Harvey. I know her number by heart, he said. I've known it for 38 years. He paused. I know her number. I just don't call it. Tonight, you call it, Steve Harvey said. There was a long silence. Steve Harvey waited in it without filling it, which was something he had learned, in rooms very different from this alley, and for different reasons, was the correct thing to do when someone was on the far side of a decision. You did not fill the silence. The silence was where the decision happened. In the silence, from somewhere in the building above them, the sound of a venue finishing its evening, the specific muffled noise of a crowd dispersing, the machinery of a large event coming down. Henry Porter reached over and took the phone. He dialed a number from memory, without looking at the keypad. He held the phone to his ear. He looked straight ahead, at the opposite wall of the alley, at the bricks. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered. Even at a distance, in the echo of an alley, Steve Harvey could hear that the voice was awake, that it had been awake. "Dad?" the voice said. Henry Porter closed his eyes. "Hi, baby," he said. "It's me." Steve Harvey stood up from the concrete step and walked to the mouth of the alley. He stood there with his back to the call, looking out at the street, giving Henry Porter the only privacy available in an alley at 11 at night. He heard, without trying to, fragments, the specific sounds of a father and a daughter beginning the conversation that had been not happening for 2 years. He heard Henry Porter say he was sorry. He heard Henry Porter say he was okay, which was not quite true and which Carol would know was not quite true, but which was what he was going to start with. He heard once Henry Porter laugh, the real version of the sound he had made earlier, the full one. The call lasted 19 minutes. When it was over, Henry Porter walked to where Steve Harvey was standing and gave him back the phone. His face had the specific quality of a face that has just put down something it had been carrying for 2 years. "She's coming," he said. Steve Harvey looked at him. "She said she's coming," Henry Porter said. "She's getting in the car right now. She said she doesn't care." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "She said she doesn't care about any of it. She just wants to know where I am." Steve Harvey made a few calls of his own, while Henry Porter sat on the cardboard and waited in the way he had learned to wait, which was quietly and without a visible expectation of how long the waiting would take. The calls were brief and practical. The people on the other end of the calls were people who had been on the other end of these specific kinds of calls before, and who did not need much explaining. Steve Harvey had been doing this for long enough that the infrastructure existed, which was its own kind of testimony to how many alleys there had been. The shelter coordinator he knew in the city, the woman at the outreach organization who had worked with him on 3 previous occasions, each of which Henry Porter did not know about and would not be told because they were not stories for the telling. He made the calls quietly and practically and without ceremony, in the way that he preferred to do this kind of thing, which was the way his mother had told him to do it, without making it about the doing. Henry Porter sang one more hymn while they waited for Carol. He sang it the same way he had been singing when Steve Harvey found him, not for anyone, not as performance, but because it was what he did with what he had. He sang Amazing Grace. He sang all 4 verses. His baritone filled the alley and went up the brick walls and out into the city night. Steve Harvey listened to all 4 verses. He thought about Henry Porter at 19, starting the job at the warehouse, 38 years old when Carol was born, which meant he had been a young father late, and Carol had grown up watching a man who showed up, who was a deacon, who knew all the words to the hymns without looking. She had watched that, and then she had watched something else, and then there had been the 2 years of not knowing. He thought about the cell phone number Henry Porter had known by heart for 38 years and had not dialed. Carol Porter arrived at 12:23 in the morning in a gray Honda with a cracked passenger side mirror and a child's sneaker visible in the back seat through the window. She parked at an angle at the mouth of the alley and got out before the car had fully stopped and walked toward her father in the specific way of someone who has been driving and crying simultaneously and has arrived. Henry Porter met her at the edge of the loading dock light. Steve Harvey walked to his car, which was still waiting, his driver patient in the professional way of a man who had driven for him long enough to understand that some evenings went differently than their schedules. He did not watch the reunion. That belonged to them. He has said, in the careful way he says the things that are partly his and partly someone else's, that the hymn was what stopped him. He has said that he has heard "His Eye is on the Sparrow" hundreds of times, and that he has never heard it sung the way Henry Porter sang it in that alley, and that the difference between that version and every other version he had heard was the difference between a thing said to an audience and a thing said because it was true. He has said, when you hear something true, you stop. He has said this in different contexts and different ways, and it has always meant the same thing, that truth has a sound, and the sound is recognizable, and when you hear it, you do not have the option of pretending you did not hear it. Not because someone requires this of you, because you have been paying attention long enough to know the difference. He has said, when you hear something true, you stop, even when you have somewhere to be, especially then. Henry Porter is in supported transitional housing in Chicago. Carol drove him there herself, the morning after the alley, with the 2 kids asleep in the back seat. He is not singing in alleys anymore. He is singing in a church choir on the west side of Chicago, which is not Greater Shiloh, but which has, according to the choir director who received him, a baritone section that has benefited considerably from the addition. Carol still has the cracked passenger side mirror. She is planning to fix it. She keeps finding other things to spend the money on first, which she does not consider a problem. Henry Porter has been in the choir for 4 months. The choir director said she had not, in 31 years, received a baritone who already knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. She said it like a compliment. It was one. Carol visits every week with the 2 kids. They have their grandfather's Sunday mornings back, which is a good thing. Steve Harvey does not tell this story as his story. He tells it as the story of a hymn in an alley that was not for anyone and was exactly right, which was what made it the most important song in that particular alley on that particular night. He tells it that way because that's what it was. If this story found you tonight, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that the Sparrow is still being watched. Tell us in the comments about the alley in your life. Ring that notification bell, because the next story might be the one that stops you.